Trinity College. You can, of course, hit that subscribe button here if you haven't already for more in response. And in the meantime, we will see you later.
It was a lot of fun, guys. See you next time.
Oh, we're still going there.
Before we get into this video, I just want to say that everything discussed here is purely speculative, but it leads to some interesting questions nonetheless. Now, these speculations come to us thanks to new job listings, where Blizzard are recruiting 2 lead software engineers to work on what they're calling a quote robust first-person engine for an unannounced project. Now, while it's not especially interesting that Blizzard are hiring some engineers, it is very interesting that they are recruiting for an unannounced project in a first-person engine. Now, of course, you think Blizzard and you think first-person, you're of course going to think Overwatch, because, well, that is the only game that Blizzard developed in a first-person engine, and that engine was of course developed internally. So while it's entirely possible that this project is something completely different to Overwatch, given how hugely successful Overwatch has been for Blizzard, I highly doubt they would release a competitor or start working on a competitor when Overwatch is still selling like gangbusters and being played by thousands of people on a daily basis. So of course we have a few options on the table. Of course, this is where the speculation part begins. We literally don't have any other clues. That's all the listings tell us. So what are the options for what they could be working on? Let's assume that it is something to do with Overwatch. So, it could be for a major expansion, perhaps a huge pack of something. Of course, they have said that maps and characters will be free, so what this expansion would be, hard to say. Or, very possibly, it could be for a campaign component for the game. Now that would be absolutely awesome. However, there is actually a third option available to us. Now this speculation is based purely on one thing and one thing only, and that is the fact that back in October, the World of Warcraft director Tom Chilton left that particular project. Now he didn't leave Blizzard, he left World of Warcraft to do something brand new. So of course it is entirely possible that we are getting a Overwatch MMO or something like that. Now, as anyone will know that is connected with this project at all, you'll know that Overwatch was born from the ashes of the now defunct MMO, which was codenamed Titan. And of course, we have a game based on those remnants. Tracer pretty much comes straight from those remnants, and obviously a bunch of the lore and stuff as well. But obviously we don't have any MMO aspects in the game, so it is entirely possible that that is still happening. Now, while that's probably going to send some people into a hype tizzy, personally I hope this is for a campaign to Overwatch. Why they need a new engine to work on this, don't know. It could just be improvements to the current engine, we just don't know. Obviously they need to make new assets and cutscenes within game and all this sort of stuff, so there is all that to consider. Now, Overwatch is a fantastic game. I love it to bits, to be honest. Like I was, as I've said many times, very surprised by how much I liked it when I played the open beta before it actually came out. I was very surprised, because normally I don't play these sorts of games. So multiplayer only FPS. Normally it's the fast road to getting me to fall asleep. But Overwatch is fantastic, but it having campaign mode would be absolutely amazing. Having to pay 10 bucks or whatever for that mode, or whatever it happens to be, I'm putting 10 bucks completely out of the air, it could be 500 bucks for all I know. That would make Overwatch even better. I mean, the story and the lore that we have already is pretty interesting. The characters are interesting. So having a fully fleshed out story and a way to perhaps play as several different characters over a certain set of events, perhaps we can learn more about the history of Overwatch, you know, how it came to be, why it was disbanded, why they're now getting back together, or even just like here's some missions where you play as Reaper and Sombra or whatever on some missions together, or whatever it happens to be. There are so many possibilities for a campaign for Overwatch. So, to be honest, I really hope that this was what it's for. Now, of course, it's entirely possible that it's nothing to do with Overwatch at all. I don't think that's very likely. So we have an expansion to the multiplayer component, but it's hard to say what that would even be. A single player campaign, or they're reviving an MMO. I don't see it being the MMO. That seems the least likely out of those three myself. But of course, it could be argued that it's no coincidence that Tom Chilton left just a month previous, and now they're looking for 2 new engineers for a first-person shooter project, and obviously Tom Chilton's wheelhouse is massive multiplayer online games. So we could be seeing Titan being revived in some form with an Overwatch MMO. So, my personal hope is that it is a campaign mode for the game. Now, moving swiftly on from speculation to confirmation, we now have a bit of an update to Symmetra that I thought just throw in here since we're talking about Overwatch. Now, basically, Symmetra is getting some big changes to her kit. Now, anyone who's played Overwatch or watched Overwatch at any point ever will know that each hero has one ultimate ability. However, Symmetra is going to be having 2 now. Now, these are detailed rather by Jeff Kaplan in a developer update, which you can see in the description below. And there are some tweaks to her turrets and her weapons, but the mainstay of the changes is the fact that she's going to have now 2 options for her ultimate ability. Now, Kaplan says, quote, Symmetra is going to be the first character to actually have a choice of ultimates. Basically, it worked the same as before. When your ultimate is charged, it will light up. However, instead of just only having the teleport move, there's now going to be a shield generator that can be placed to protect the entire team. Not only that, she's getting an entirely new move by the name of Photon Barrier. Now, this was compared to both Reinhardt and Winston's shields, although Symmetra's version is an elliptical projectile that moves along a trajectory. So this can be used both offensively and defensively, and Kaplan said, quote, it's really effective if you're hanging behind your time and they don't have somebody like Reinhardt. Maybe they have a Roadhog and Zarya as their tanks up front. You can then a projected barrier out in front of you, and it sort of signals your whole team to follow with it. For those of you wondering, very quickly, the changes to her primary weapon are range, and you can also stock 6 turrets at once, and basically means that Symmetra will be more aggressive. Now, to be honest, I like these changes a lot. I really do. I mean, I haven't played Symmetra all that often, but it does feel like past a certain point in the game, this isn't all that useful, because, well, the teleport is going to get destroyed too quickly, or she kind of has to hand back from the rest of the team because, well, as much damage as she does, she is quite squishy and all this other stuff. So these changes would definitely help, I think, and it's going to be interesting to see how exactly this changes the way she is played, and I really like to see how these new moves, like the ultimate and the Photon Barrier, come into play. So again, the link to the developer update is in the description below. So, let the speculation commence. What do you think Blizzard are working on with this unannounced first-person engine thing? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.
The enemy has shattered a forecourt.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Game to the Con video, we're going to be discussing PC versus console. It's a bit of a tired argument, a very old argument. However, a couple of interviews have recently popped up, the latest being from Alienware co-founder and vice president Frank Azure. He believes with consoles evolving to be a lot more like PCs, the PC has basically won by default.
The way is clear. Guardians, do not let these mortals approach them.
Perhaps I'm not the only prodigy here after all.
That was a kill. My temple's magic subsides. Find something else to fight over.
Hello, it's Scott Manley here, and today I would like to talk to you about the EM drive. Yes, it's that copper can which has been somehow making science writers get very excited and talk about flying to the moon in a few hours or to Mars in a week or so. So let's rewind things a little. Let's actually talk about where the EM drive started. So originally it was invented by a guy called Roger Scheuer in 1999. And the idea is that it would generate thrust purely from electricity. No reaction mass needed, which would of course be fantastic for spacecraft. It would mean you wouldn't have to carry around that very heavy reaction mass. However, it's not so good for people that like physics because this does kind of break the laws of physics. Interestingly, another guy called Guido Feta came up with a variation on this, again, uses electrical power to generate thrust. He called his the Canny drive, which was supposedly some reference to Animal Crossing the Alps, but more likely it's a reference to Scotty from Star Trek, who was often heard to say, "You can't change the laws of physics, Captain." It's back in the news because an academic paper on the experiment has finally passed peer review and been studied. So if you're not in academia, you may not actually know what this means. When you write up your experiment into a paper form, you will then send it to the publisher, who will then pass it out to people that are supposed to know what you're talking about, people that are experts in the field. And these people will read the paper, they will perhaps find problems with the paper, and they will send this feedback back, and then of course you are supposed to address these problems and then send a revised version, and eventually either the paper gets published or it gets rejected. So having it pass through a peer review process is generally a good sign. It means that it's no longer on the fringes of crazy crank, physics. However, it doesn't really mean that they prove that things work. I mean, to start with, the people that are reviewing these papers, this is an experiment. They haven't gone out and done their own version of the experiment to verify. What they've done is they've kind of looked at what's been written up and said, well, do you have a control experiment, or did you test this? Did you we'd like you to cite this particular paper. It doesn't really necessarily prove that it works in any way. And I, personally, still believe that it's highly likely that they will find a flaw. The reviewers of the paper, they looked through it and they've clearly had a lot of feedback, because there was a whole section where the authors of the paper try to address possible modes for operation, which are possible things that were not accounted for, and then provide some justification for why they were accounted for. Anyway, perhaps more on that later. Let's talk about how it's supposed to work. So it's actually called a resonant cavity electromagnetic thruster. What it is you have a sealed space and you inject microwaves of a specific frequency and they bounce around in all sorts of directions. And when you generally have sealed spaces, you can have the walls at just the right distance so it resonates at particular frequencies, hence the resonance. This is useful because it means that the microwaves can bounce back and forth several times and they hang around longer, which is a good thing. So in the case of the EM drive, you're supposed to pump in the microwaves and somehow you feel a force in one direction. So the EM drive is different from many other resonant cavities in that the walls are not all parallel. You have a parallel front and rear wall, and then it's a conical shape. A frustrum is the technical term. So it is narrower at one end than it is at the other end. And the inventor claims that this is essentially a waveguide, and the narrower waveguide at one end means that the group velocity of the waves is lower, and therefore the momentum is lower. So the reflection at one end is reflecting less momentum than the other end, which is wider and therefore has higher group velocity and therefore higher momentum. So you should feel a thrust in one direction. That's the claim. And it's not just the EagleWorks team that has built it. At least three teams I've seen have built this and done experiments on it. Perhaps most high profile was a team in China led by someone called Professor Yang. They built a system and they ran it, they wrote up a paper on it, they claimed to have measured thrust, but later they retracted that paper after they figured out that they were getting induced thrust, I believe, through cables. Any thrust that was left over was below the level that they would be able to measure with their apparatus. There's another team in Germany led by a guy called Martin Tajmar. I probably mispronounced his name. And they claim to have seen thrust. And I also heard somewhere that they may have retracted that claim, but I couldn't find that on the internet. So people in the comments, please, citations would be good. But yeah, look, the one we're really talking about is the NASA team, the EagleWorks team, who kind of like to do stuff out in the fringes, like warp drive. There's another thing they've looked at. So the nice thing about NASA, of course, is that it's in the business of spaceflight. It knows, it has the hardware sitting around. It's like, oh, do you mind if we use your vacuum chamber and torsion balance? Nobody else is using them right now. So the team were able to exploit this, and it was a pretty cheap thing. I mean, they literally built their EM drive in their dining room. So they took their device and put it on a torsion balance, which is a device which measures very small forces by rotation. You have it hanging from a very thin cable, and the twisting of the cable provides the spring that pushes your scales back. Torsion balances were used for the original Cavendish measurement of the constant of gravitation, I believe. So there's a long history of them being used to measure very, very small and weak forces. The original test campaign was carried out in an atmosphere, and that led to many criticisms because, of course, the atmosphere could be generating convective forces and things like that. So instead, they eventually managed to get vacuum-capable microwave-generating hardware, put it inside a vacuum chamber, and that's what this paper is about. In the current set of results, they claim that they observe a small force in one direction when they turn on the device. They also say that when the power is increased, the amount of force observed increases, and flipping the device to point it in the opposite direction generates force in the opposite direction. The magnitude of this force is 1.2 micronewtons per watt. And this is important because that is significantly higher than what you would expect from photon thrust. So there is actually a real device which generates thrust purely through electricity. It's called a photon thruster. What you're really doing is you're generating light and you're shooting it out in one direction, and it generates recoil in the other direction, because photons, while they are massless, they carry momentum. The amount of energy required is pretty staggering. You need 300 megawatts for 1 newton of force. And well, the upside of photon rocket is that it does have the best possible specific impulse of just light and get any faster. This actually has been observed in many systems. Solar sails actually make use of it. But interestingly, the Pioneer anomaly is commonly cited by EM drive advocates as an example of new physics, where the Pioneer probe was experiencing extra force pushing it back towards the solar system. That was because of the radioisotope thermoelectric generator being on one side of the spacecraft, and therefore the photons, thermal photons coming off of the radiators were preferentially going off in one direction and producing a thrust in the other direction. So be under no illusion, the Pioneer 10 anomaly is not new physics, it is photon thrust physics, which is well understood. So coming back, yes, the EM drive appears to generate more thrust than this based upon the experiments. But yeah, I'm a little skeptical because, hey, I'm a physicist. I spent a long time studying physics, and I'm not about to have them change physics out from underneath me. Having dark energy come in, that really messed up my view of the universe. Look, the EM drive fundamentally has this problem with conservation of momentum. That, you know, you really don't want to break that. And the proponents, the advocates of the drive say, well, maybe it's generating thrust by coupling to the quantum vacuum. Maybe it's pushing against quantum vacuum virtual particles. That's their exact phrase. And I believe that John Baez, an expert in quantum vacuum, pretty much called this claim bull. Reactionless drives are just not things you want to have around. You know, there's a quote on atomic rockets: friends don't let friends use reactionless drives because they just break too much physics to be sane. If you have a reactionless drive that works by generating force when you put electricity into it without a recoil, then hey, you end up being able to do things like generate perpetual motion machines. And nothing freaks physicists out more than claiming you have a perpetual motion machine or claiming that you are getting over unity out of your system. The way this works is that Newton's law says that the amount of work done by a system is equal to the force times the velocity. So as the EM drive system would accelerate, the amount of energy that it is putting into the system in terms of kinetic energy would increase, but the amount of electrical energy it's generating would stay the same. So eventually it will reach some velocity where the amount of kinetic energy it's getting out is greater than the amount of electrical energy it's putting in. So you could just build a wheel with a bunch of EM drives around the outside and drive that up to the critical speed, and then it would go faster and faster, and you could just tap off that energy and get free energy back. That is just something that physicists do not like. So the EM drive proponents, they say, well, maybe it generates less thrust as it goes faster. And that then runs into problems with relativity, because relativity, of course, says that velocity is measured relative to the observer. So different observers would see the EM drive at different speeds, but they would somehow measure it generating, it would somehow accelerate differently depending upon the observer. That would, of course, cause all sorts of problems with special relativity, and special relativity has been pretty well established to work pretty darn well. They've also said that, hey, maybe it's better at hovering, because you're basically staying still, no change in velocity, you know. Anti-gravity, that would be fantastic. But that then runs into general relativity. General relativity says if you're standing inside a closed room and you can't see outside it, and you're feeling a force of 9.8 meters per second pulling you to the ground, you cannot tell the difference between that being inside a rocket accelerating at that speed or standing on the surface of a planet getting pulled down at that speed. This is like a fundamental part of the formulation of general relativity, which has been pretty well tested. So having it hover, yeah, that would again all cause issues. Hovering is the same as accelerating. So obviously I'm not convinced, but I'm prepared to wait for more data. However, the device as demonstrated, even if it does work, is still not that useful. And to be fair, they did say that they had not optimized their device for performance. They're getting 1.2 micronewtons per watt, and I believe the best numbers I've seen from a nuclear reactor in space has been 200 watts per kilogram. So that works out to about 20 meters per second of acceleration per day. This device is not going to be able to carry you to the moon in a few hours or to Mars, at least at this performance level. It works out to about 7 kilometers per second per year. Ion engines are way better at this level. For a start, they're a lot lighter and they can work, they work with fuel. You have to get up to like 30, 40, 50 kilometers per second of delta V and missions that are lasting 5, 10 years before an EM drive becomes even slightly competitive. And there aren't any missions with those requirements right now. So I don't see that displacing ion thrusters unless they could make it work better, and it's certainly not causing things to fly or getting you to Mars very quickly. Yeah, maybe they can optimize it. As I said, they literally built this in a dining room. If you look at resonant cavities, electromagnetic resonant cavities that are actually used in science for good science, these things are built to incredibly high tolerances. They are typically machined from a solid block of copper, and the end plates are bolted on with really heavy, tight bolts, so this thing does not change shape at all because they want to get the highest quality factor out of the device. The thing that was built, I heard one scientist describe it as something my mother-in-law might hang off a tree to scare away wild animals. And they think this is somehow going to change the laws of physics. Look, at this stage, it is little more than a curiosity. I don't believe it's going to change the laws of physics, but obviously I'm a skeptic. The paper does have flaws as well that have been identified. For example, one of the authors claims that there are no analytical solutions for standing waves inside a frustrum of that design. And I believe that Greg Egan, science fiction author, he presented analytical solutions for this. He's not just an author, he's a mathematical physicist, so he knows his stuff. There's other problems with the paper, and there'll hopefully be follow-up work. It'd be really nice to see them actually build a control device, a copper cylinder, which doesn't have a taper, and then put that on the device, on the balance, and see if it generates thrust. But yeah, at this point, I really think the experimental error is the most likely thing. If they do fly it in space, then and they do generate thrust, no one would be more pleased than me. It would not only mean that everything I'd learned was wrong, but it would actually mean that we could fly spaceships around and stuff like that. At some point, I fully expect to see a retraction and